No Bad Parts, Healing Trauma and Restoring Wholeness with the Internal Family Systems Model, written by Richard C. Schwartz, Ph.D., read by Zen Naomi Kirst-Schultz. We are on Chapter 3. This changes everything. In Christianity, the definition of sin is anything that disconnects you from God and takes you off your path. Burdens disconnect self from parts and give them extreme impulses. Burdened parts either don't experience self at all or don't listen to self. So when parts are unburdened, it's not only that they immediately transform, but they also now have much more connection to and trust for self, which is the second goal of IFS. When I began understanding that, I saw parallels between the inner world and the outer world. Just as people walk around feeling disconnected from each other and from whatever they call God, what I will refer to as self, due to the burdens or sin they carry, parts also wander around feeling disconnected from each other and from us. Their unburdening not only allows for that reconnection inside, but it also fosters more connection between yourself and whatever you want to call the big self. As we do this kind of healing, we're not only helping ourselves not have symptoms and feel better, but we are also connecting the dots. It's as if there is a piece of God, for lack of a better word, in all of us, and as it turns out, in all of our parts. Having done IFS with people diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, I've often found myself talking directly to one of their parts across multiple sessions. As I did that, the part would start talking about its parts, and I eventually learned that the part had a self as well. At first, this was mind-blowing. Parts having parts? But after I calmed down, it made a kind of aesthetic or spiritual sense that we would have parallel or isomorphic, same form systems at every level. It's like those Russian stacking dolls, similar systems embedded within bigger systems. Another analogy would be fractals. While it was disconcerting at first, there's something beautiful about this nested parallel systems phenomenon for me, although I don't know how far it goes. I've actually worked with sub-parts of a part and come to find that it had parts too. As I said before, I've come to see parts as sacred beings. They contain their own self, and they're worthy of the love and compassion of yourself. Back to Christianity. This seems parallel to the idea that people are created in God's image and are worthy of God's love. If people can unburden, transform into their true nature, and feel reconnected to something larger, why wouldn't it be the same for parts? For several years, we did IFS trainings for the Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson, Mississippi, and all the students were evangelical Christians. I knew I'd be telling them that people were basically good, and so I expected them to argue that people were basically bad. And indeed, we had that debate. I asked, "Doesn't it say in the Bible that man is created in the image of God?" They replied, "Yes, that's true, but it's just this little seed in there and it's covered over by all of this original sin." And I said, well, if we can translate original sin as burdens, we're talking the same language. Their professor, Bill Richardson, summed it up nicely. "You know," he said, "I kind of know what you're trying to do here. You're asking us to do inside ourselves what Jesus did in the outside world. That is, Jesus went with compassion and curiosity and care to the exiles in the outside world and healed them, the lepers, the poor, the outcasts." Getting back to connecting the dots, what if each of us and each of our parts contains a piece of self that longs to reconnect with itself? What if, by helping parts unburden and trust ourself so that we feel our connectedness to other people, to the planet, and to self, we are serving this larger project of divine reconnection? I think this is what IFS offers spiritual seekers. Our enlightenment is much brighter and more sustained if all of us, is involved, and we don't treat the ego as this bad part we have to leave behind in the dust on the way to attaining that enlightenment. Our parts long for connection to ourself, just as much as we long to connect to self. When people spend time exploring inside, they all come to the same conclusion, that this essential self is who we really are. I think that what's often called awakening or enlightenment is the embodied realization of that fact, and that shift from identifying with your parts and their burdens to identifying as yourself has profound implications. What we're talking about transcends any particular religion and doesn't even require that you believe in something spiritual, just that you come to accept that there is this beautiful essence in you and everyone else, and that it can be accessed simply by opening space inside. Some meditations do this by emptying the mind, but in IFS, instead of wrestling with parts that don't want to be emptied, we lovingly ask them to open space inside for a few minutes and then find that self emerges immediately and spontaneously. Again, this is all a lot of talk until you actually experience it for yourself. So let's shift now to some exercises that are designed to help you get to know your parts better and bring more self to them. Exercise. Dilemma meditation. Once again, I invite you to get comfortable and take some deep breaths. Now, think of a dilemma in your life, either one that you are currently facing or one that you faced in the past. Pick an issue that you've experienced a lot of conflict around. And as you focus on this dilemma, notice the parts on each side of it and notice how they battle with each other. And then notice how you feel toward that battle or toward each part in the battle. Now, let's get to know each of those parts, one at a time. To do that, you're going to ask one of them to go into a kind of waiting room. That will create a bit of a boundary that will allow the one you're currently working with to relax a little bit. So, get to know the one who's not in the waiting room first. And again, notice what you're feeling toward it. If you're feeling anything negative, we're going to ask the parts associated with those negative feelings to just let you get to know it for a few minutes. We're not going to give the attended to part more power to take over and get whatever it wants. We're just going to try to get to know it. To do that, the one you have in the waiting room, or any of its allies who are making themselves known, needs to pull its energy out of you. You can reassure it, that is, the one in the waiting room, that it'll have a time with you too, so maybe that will help it be a little more patient. If you can get to a point of at least being curious about the one who's not in the waiting room, go ahead and follow your curiosity and ask it what it wants you to know about its position. Why does it take such a strong position on this issue? What is it afraid would happen if the other one took over and won the battle? As you listen to it, you don't have to agree or disagree. Just let the part know that you respect it. You care about it, you're there with it, and you hear it. See how it reacts. In the next minute or so, I want you to ask the part you've been speaking with to go into a separate waiting room. Then let the other one out so you can get to know it in the same way. And again, you're trying to have an open heart and open mind as you listen to its side. You don't have to agree. You just kind of want to get where it's coming from, why it's so charged up about this, what it's afraid would happen if the other side won, and so on. After you've worked with that second part for a while, ask if it would be willing to talk to the other one directly. Reassure it that you are there to mediate and to make sure they stay respectful toward each other. It's okay if the part's not willing to do that. If that happens, you won't take the next steps, but if it is willing, then invite the other one to come and sit down with the two of you. Now, you're going to kind of be their therapist as they talk to each other about this issue. And again, your job isn't to take a side, it's just to help them get to know each other in a different way and make sure they respect each other when they talk. Remind them that they're both a part of you, so they have that in common. Then just see how they react as they get to know each other in this different way. Notice what happens to the dilemma. At some point, pause their discussion. Let them both know that you can meet with them more regularly in this way and ask them if they would be willing to give you their input on dilemmas in the future, but then trust you to make the final decision. They would act more like advisors for you rather than having the responsibility of making bigger decisions like this one on their own. See how they react to that idea. As before, it can help to remind them of who you are, age-wise, etc., and who you are not. In the next minute or two, thank them both for however much they did and be sure to remind them that you're going to try to return. Then, begin to shift your focus back to the outside world. If your parts cooperated, it's likely you found that they really didn't know each other. This is because they've been in polarized roles with each other and had extreme visions of who the other one was. We see the same thing play out in international conflicts as well as within countries, companies, families, and couples. The more extreme one side gets, the more the other side has to get extreme in the other direction. This process happens at all levels of human systems, particularly when there isn't good leadership, and it's no less true with inner systems. Most of us have neglected our inner worlds, and we've left it to these inner children to try and make these big decisions and hash it out, as we've been busy out here. One shot at this probably isn't enough to stop the battle, because the stakes feel so high for each part, and the idea of totally relaxing is anathema to them. But at least they feel a little more connected to you and to each other. This is the kind of new leadership that I'm inviting you to try out inside. Really, it's the same approach I use when working with a couple. I listen to one, then listen to the other, and in so doing, I make a connection so they both trust me. Then I bring them together, make sure they're respectful, and have them talk in this different way. Check-in. By now, I've led you through 4 different exercises designed to help you either get to know your parts or have them get to know you. Maybe it's gone smoothly and you're feeling pretty good about that, but it wouldn't be uncommon at all if you couldn't do one or all of the exercises or you were only able to do pieces of them. A lot of that has to do with how ready your parts are to let you invade their world this way, and how much they trust you and trust each other to open space and separate. So if they're not stepping back, for example, it doesn't mean you're failing. It simply means that it will take more time to build up their trust in you and to help them get to know you better. If you have been able to do the exercises, it simply means that, for whatever reason, your parts have a certain amount of trust in you already and they're willing to open space. That's not true for all of us. Unfortunately, some of us have had plenty of terrible experiences in our lives, but that just means that it might take a little more time for our parts to trust that this type of dialogue will be useful. At this point, you may also find yourself having strange experiences during the exercises. Maybe you become unusually sleepy, find yourself thinking about other things you have to do, or get a headache. None of that is uncommon. When protectors aren't ready, they feel like they've got to distract you or take you out in some way that makes it more difficult for you to do the exercise. Don't fight them on it. My advice is to just get to know the resisting ones from this curious place. Find out what they're afraid of, and honor their fears. Exercise. Working with a challenging protector. This exercise can prove challenging, especially if you're new to IFS work. If that's the case for you, just do your best to get to know the parts that aren't so ready. Take a second and get comfortable setting up like you would if you were going to meditate. Think of a part of you that really bothers you or gets in your way, one that you have a lot of shame about or one you might be afraid of. Take a second to think of one. What you're looking for is more of a protective part than a real vulnerable one. Some people immediately focus on their inner critics for this exercise, so If you're having trouble finding one, that usually does the job. As you focus on the part, notice where you find it in your body or around your body, and while you focus on that place, notice how you feel towards this part. Because of what you're looking for, you're probably going to have some strained feelings toward it. Place this part of you in a contained room in there. That will help other parts of you to drop their weapons and feel a little safer. Make it a comfortable room, but one that it can't get out of and that you can see through a window. And let all these other parts that have issues with it know that for the duration of the exercise, it's going to stay contained. So ask them to relax just a little bit so you can get to a point of curiosity toward the one in the room. See if they are willing to do that. If they're not willing to separate, again, that's okay. You can spend the rest of the time just getting to know them and their fears of this other part, or what issues they have with it. If you can get to a point of curiosity or any kind of openness toward the part that's in the room, then let it know that and see what it wants you to know while it stays contained. See if you can communicate with it through the window. What does it want you to know about itself? What's it afraid would happen if it stepped out of its role? If it answered that question, then see if it's possible to extend some appreciation to it for at least trying to protect you and see how old it thinks you are. If it thinks you're a different age than you actually are, then go ahead and update it. See how it reacts. Now ask this part some version of the following question. Quote, if you could change or heal what you're protecting so that it wasn't really an issue anymore and you were freed from this responsibility of protection and could do something else, what would you like to do? Unquote. That is, if the part were totally liberated from its role, what else would it choose to do? After it answers that question, ask what it needs from you in the future. Then, check with your other parts before we stop. Just see how they're reacting as they witness this conversation you had with the protector part. When the time feels right, I invite you to finish up in there, thanking your parts for anything they let happen, letting them know this isn't your last visit. Taking deep breaths again, if that helps, shift your focus back outside. Some years ago, I was invited to present briefly to the Dalai Lama at a conference called Mind and Life Europe. I talked with him about what I've been covering here, and then I asked him a question. Quote, Your Holiness, you ask us to offer compassion to people who are our enemies, or at least to think of them with compassion. What would it be like if we did that with our inner enemies too? Unquote. That's what this exercise is all about, to help you go to your inner enemies. Having compassion for them might be difficult at first, but ideally we start out with an open mind and really try to get to know them. I don't know if this happened for you, but if you stay with it, and you keep asking questions that are non-threatening, these inner enemies will reveal their secret stories of how they got forced into these roles, and what they're protecting, and how, in many cases, they were really heroes. As Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote, if we could read the secret history of our enemies, we should find in each man's life sorrow and suffering enough to disarm all hostility. We go to an inner enemy and listen to their secret histories, and inevitably it does dissolve all the hostility in other parts of you that didn't like it. That's really great for inner enemies. They are all good parts, forced into roles they don't like, they don't deserve, and they are eager to leave, but they just don't think it's safe enough to do that. Part of why they don't think it's safe is because they don't trust you as the leader. Your coming to them this way is helping to build that trust. One more thing. You might find as you do this work that things start to shift both in your inner life and in your outer life. As you adopt this different paradigm, it's hard to look at people the same way, which means that you begin to relate to them in a different way. Some people may have trouble with these changes in you, but some people will surely welcome it. This has been No Bad Parts, Healing Trauma and Restoring Wholeness with the Internal Family Systems Model, written by Richard C. Schwartz, read by Zen Naomi Kirst-Schultz. This was Chapter 3, This Changes Everything. Thanks for reading along with me.